onto your butt.
Da-da-da. Oh, hello. Welcome to episode 163 of the Civil War Breakfast Club podcast. Once again, I'm joined by Mary, a woman who is planning on celebrating Valentine's Day by looking to see if Girardelli Chocolates makes an IPA. I am just Cupid's broken arrow named Darren. Happy Valentine's Day, Mary. How are we doing?
Good. How are you?
Well, happy Veterans Day. As Take One said. So.
Take One said Veterans Day.
Anyway, what's going on? How are you?
Well, I'm curious to know as to how I would have been celebrating Veterans Day.
I don't know. It's a good question. Good question at all. So what's going on tonight? How are you doing, Mary?
Well, it's good to be back recording again. We are almost halfway through February.
I guess we are. I guess we. No,
it's the Ides of February.
It's February's 28 days, right? So it is halfway. Tomorrow is. It doesn't matter.
Whatever.
Well, before we get started, I will ask you that question again because I am a gracious host as usual. But what, of course, is that? What are you drinking tonight?
I am drinking 2 times IPA by Southern Tier, which is a brewery out of New York, and I'm drinking it out of a John Brown mug.
Oh.
And what, my good sir, are you drinking?
Oh, thank you. I'm drinking, it's called Columbus Brewing Company. It's called Bodie? I don't know. It's a double IPA a friend of ours brought from Ohio, and I'm drinking
you're drinking Ohio beer.
I am. I'm drinking out of my Abraham Lincoln mug because yesterday was his 217th birthday, or the 12th was, Monday was. Yesterday. I don't know what the lose my crap.
Yesterday was the 12th.
Whatever the day was, but he had a birthday coming up. He's
Do you
not
know what year you're in right now?
2026. All right.
Okay.
Anyway, listen. Tonight we're going to talk about the first African American regiment from the North to be formed and fight in the American Civil War. Not going to be a Valentine's Day episode, Mary.
And it was not the 54th Massachusetts.
Despite what you may have heard or read online, this black regiment was not from Massachusetts. It was not featured in the movie Glory. This distinction belongs, of course, to the 1st Kansas Colored Infantry Regiment, which was formed in August of 1862. Now, wait a second, Mary. How is this possible? I mean, the Emancipation Proclamation allowing blacks to fight in the Federal Army hadn't been released yet.
Well, that's because it is organized as a state unit.
Right. So let's get into that a little bit. Before we get into the details of who, how, and why, I guess, the first Kansas was created, we have to turn back time.
If I could turn back time.
Oh, why keep doing that? Basically talk about the goings on in Kansas as well as the government of the time. First, let's talk Kansas, right? Kansas had been dealing with fighting over slavery since before the war, going back to 1855 and 56. With the bleeding Kansas battles with guerrillas primarily from next door Missouri. Now, the fighting was caused by the creation of the Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854, which ended the Missouri Compromise. It meant that whether Kansas was going to be a free or a slave state would be determined by popular vote, by sovereignty. Pro-slavery proponents flooded to Kansas with the hope of using their muscles to have Kansas vote in favor of having it as a slave-holding state. Now, when the Civil War broke out on April 12th of 1861, men from the North rushed to enlist as war fever was all the rage and people wanted to be part of the war because they assumed it would be a quick one. In many northern states, men were actually turned away because their quotas had been filled. Not only were white men turned away, Mary, but also some free blacks who saw military service as a pathway to eventual citizenship. Now, in reality, they'd have been turned away anyway because even if there was a need, because even in the abolitionist cities like Boston, white supremacy was still common and the real true abolitionists were a very small minority. Well, you may have heard, Mary, the war didn't end quickly. And that fervor to join fizzled faster than my Super Bowl dreams as those casualty numbers climbed and the Union war effort in the East struggled. Now, for that reason, the Union needed more soldiers as enlistments were coming to an end and many chose to go home instead of re-enlisting. So what we saw was states begin to offer those bounties, to sign up. And eventually in 1863, there was the draft that we talked about.
Yep.
While all this was going on, Congress passed laws that would directly lead to the story that we're going to tell here. August 6th, 1861, Congress passed the first Confiscation Act, which allowed the federal government to seize property, which included slaves, that were being used to support the Confederacy. Now, the act went nowhere. That's why on July 17th, 1862, the second Confiscation Act, the Search for Curly's Gold, was written. This second act allowed the federal government to free slaves in conquered rebel territory and prohibited the return of fugitive slaves, ending that controversial Fugitive Slave Act, which, required the Northerners to return escaped slaves, or face prosecution. This act was also partnered with the Militia Act of 1862, which not only set a quota system for state-level regiments, but also, combined with the Second Confiscation Act, it allowed states to recruit African-American soldiers to enlist in their militias. So this has nothing to do with the Emancipation Proclamation, which was not a law. It was an act. But a decree with these acts opened the door for blacks to serve in the state militias. Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation allowed them to serve in the federal army, but this would not come until the following January.
January 1st, 1863 was when it would come into play.
So how does this affect, overall Kansas? Kansas was in a very unusual spot. It was primarily due to its geography because it was on the fringe. It was way out there. It was isolated. It was far away from all the major threats, the major theaters of the war. It was out of sight, out of mind from Washington. Mm-hmm. It just was. Because they were so far away, they were kind of ignored and had to kind of rely on themselves and their own resources. Missouri was their neighbor to the east, and it was a border state, but it had a large slave population that was, for the most part, pro-secession. On the Kansas-Missouri border was the area where Bleeding Kansas took place in 1856. Missouri ruffians were going into Kansas looking to attack anyone who wanted Kansas to remain a free state. To Kansas's south was the Cherokee Indian Territory, modern-day Oklahoma. And although the Cherokee Nation would abolish slavery themselves in February 20th of 1863, they didn't really have to free them until later that summer. So during the first 2 years of the war, Kansas had slave territories on their eastern and southern borders with little help or attention from Washington how to deal with it. So just like me on a Friday night, Mary, they were kind of on an island by themselves. Right? So you look at the numbers. In 1862, Kansas only had 12 total regiments to defend their state, as well as support the overall Union military effort. Compared to the great Commonwealth of Massachusetts, Mary, who had 60 regiments in 1862, had no belligerent neighbors on their borders, although personally I would consider Connecticut belligerent, but that's another story.
Are they even part of New England?
I don't know. I don't even consider them New England. But to help defend Kansas, the state needed more troops, but it was easier said than done. In 1862, according to the state census figures, Kansas had just under 60,000 white men, and 20% of them were already enlisted in the Union Army, spread over those 12 Kansas regiments. Massachusetts, as a comparison again, had 600,000 white men, most of whom played on the 1986 Boston Celtics. But doing this math, this was almost exactly 10 times as much as Kansas had. Mm-hmm. So Kansas, again, is in the midst of having two demographic jumps in population, with blacks and Cherokees escaping slavery to seek freedom into Kansas. In 1860, the black population in Kansas was just 620. This was men, women, and children. When the war began, escaped slaves again were coming into Kansas. They jumped that population in just 2 years. It went from 620 to over 6,000, many of them military-aged men. So again, what you have is a situation where the population of white military-aged men is shrinking, while black and Cherokee military-aged men are increasing at the exact same time that there was an urgent need for troops to defend Kansas. So what Kansas needed was someone to make a bold and historic decision, and they found one in Kansas Senator James Henry Lane.
Yep, and he was a leader of the Jayhawkers in Bleeding, Kansas. As Darren said, he's a senator. He was born on June 22nd, 1814, and he is the son of Amos Lane, and he was born in Indiana, and he practiced law where he was admitted to the state bar during 1840, and during the Mexican-American War, he commanded the 3rd and 5th Indiana regiments.
Now, Amos, his father was a congressman.
Yeah.
And so James studied law in his father's office. He didn't even go to law school.
No.
So he kind of grew up in that. He's going to pass the Indiana bar in 1840.
And what's interesting is he voted for the Kansas-Nebraska Act.
Yeah, and he was elected Indiana's lieutenant governor after the war, after Mexico,
Yep.
as a Democrat. He'll serve from 1849 to 1853. He'll be elected to Congress in 1853, holding that seat until 1855. Now, Lane is going to move to the Kansas Territory, where he will witness Bleeding Kansas when Kansas became the 34th state on January 29, 1861. He will be elected to be one of their senators. Lane was not a capital A abolitionist.
No, and that's what I find interesting about him is he was not an abolitionist, but here he is about to do this thing.
No, because he hated secession.
Yeah.
That was his big deal. When Fort Sumter gets fired on, like you said, Lane is going to raise troops in Kansas called the Jayhawkers. It'll eventually be known as Lane's Brigade.
Yep.
He'll be the only brigade in the war that will be led by a sitting U.S. senator. Now, Lane was hated by the pro-slavers in Missouri. Hated like water, okay? On August 21st, 1861, he'll be targeted for death by rebel guerrilla and fun lover William Quantrill when he attacked the pro-Union town of Lawrence, Kansas. Now, it's 200 people are going to be killed, but Lane's going to escape Quantrill's raid. He's going to hide out in a cornfield for the night. Lane's brigade is going to later see action at the Battle of Dry Woods Creek in Missouri. You don't see too many Facebook pages about that one, by the way.
No.
In September of 61, as well as the Union raid in Osceola, Missouri later. But the thing about Lane, though, is he knew Kansas needed men. And he, being a lawyer and being a senator and being smart, he knew the law very well. You know what law he knew really, really well? The Second Conscription Act and the Militia Act of 1864.
Which would allow him to recruit African-American troops.
So he's going to basically adhere to the philosophy that it's better to ask for apology than permission. He decided to create something exciting and new, just like the Love Boat, right? Exciting. And so what he's going to ultimately do early in August of 1862, Lane is going to notify Secretary of War Edwin Stanton that, hey, I'm going to recruit 4 white regiments and 2 black regiments, in quote, I am receiving Negroes under the latest acts of Congress. Is there any objection? Now, 3 weeks later, as you can imagine,
Stanton said, oh, no, you didn't.
Stanton is going to send Lane a reply. And it wasn't a candygram. It wasn't flowers. It wasn't a Vermont teddy bear. Okay, it was nothing. Stanton told Lane that President Lincoln had not authorized any black units, so they would not be accepted into the Union Army, and they would receive no support from Washington, the War Department, which meant black soldiers would receive no pay, no supplies, no weapons, nothing. Not even the DQ cards.
Not even a Vinegar Valentine?
Not even Vinegar Valentine. But during those 3 weeks, when Lane wrote the letter and he got the response, he took advantage of that time to openly recruit African Americans, knowing that he would have time to do it while he waited for Lincoln's no answer. You know when you tell a lie and you're in that buffer zone until you get caught? You're right in the
you're
middle.
like, I'm good. I'm good.
That's where Lane was. He knew that he had to recruit as fast as he could because he knew he was going to get the nope letter.
Yeah.
But the thing about it, Lane had no intention of listening to Lincoln, and he knew that he was going to ignore him when those reasons came. Like I said earlier, Kansas was far from Washington.
Yeah.
They were on their own, and Lincoln, by the way, had no way to stop it. Was he going to send federal troops to put down Kansas Black Union Regiment?
Could you imagine?
I mean, so he knew. So Lane knew he had him, right? For all these reasons, Kansas was the perfect storm for this. So on Wednesday, August 6th, 1862, recruiting began for what will be known as the 1st Kansas Colored Infantry, which is just going to become the first black regiment to be raised in the North 5 months before the creation of the 54th Massachusetts.
Yep.
The answer was Z, none of the above.
Yep.
But go ahead.
I was going to say many of the recruits in the 1st Kansas are going to be former slaves from Missouri. There's going to be some freedmen as well. So some had been emancipated, but others had to escape to find their freedom.
Right. Unlike the 54th Mass, which was a lot of educated people they wanted.
There was even African Americans that came down from Canada to join the 54th.
They were 95% escaped slaves for the most part. Not just black slaves, but also Indian slaves from Cherokees. Recruitment was done in 2 places under the command of James Monroe Williams. He was formerly of the 5th Kansas Cavalry, and this took place in Leavenworth. And the second one took place in Mound City, led by Henry C. Seaman, who was also part of the 5th Kansas Cavalry. What they wanted to recruit 10 companies of 100 men each to create that traditional 1,000-man regiment. Now, they would have a tough time recruiting up to this point, but part of their recruitment strategy was through ads in local newspapers. It promised pay, rations, and most important, freedom for the recruit as well as his family. One advertisement read, quote, "Every colored man enlisting who may have claimed as a slave shall receive, in addition to his rations, a certificate of freedom for himself and freedom for his mother, wife, and children." They also were promised that they would be a liberating army. They weren't going to be working on ditches. They were going to be fighting men.
Yeah, and that's what Lane promoted, this idea of using fugitive slaves in combat. And he said that the effect of marching an army on the soil of any slave state will be to instill into the slaves a determined purpose to free themselves. And that will crush out everything that stands in the way of acquiring that freedom. So he was, in this you can tell he's against secession, but he's thinking like, you march an army of freed slaves into a place where there's slaves, that is going to fire them up enough that they're going to want to leave. And Lane envisioned there would be a colored army marching out of the slave states while the Army of Freedom was marching in.
Mm-hmm. Within the first week of recruiting, both recruiting stations in Fort Mount and in Leavenworth, Mount City, each had signed 50 men each. Within 3 weeks, they had enough recruits to fill 3 companies. And in just about a month, they completed that goal of filling all 10 100-man companies. So they had themselves a full regiment. The 1st Kansas Colored Volunteer Infantry, again, included blacks, like we said, but also Cherokees who came over from modern-day Oklahoma. They came north. And for the most part, they said 95% of the 1st Kansas were escaped slaves who came from several states. You mentioned some of them. I looked up the stats with the Kansas Historical Society, Mary. 40% of the 1st Kansas soldiers came from Missouri, 35% from Kentucky, and the remaining 25% from Bama, Arkansas, Mississippi, North and South Carolina, Tennessee, Virginia, and as you mentioned, one was a Black Hawk Indian from Canada. So the thing about it, though, is like Lane promised them pay and uniforms. And Lane soon discovered that the Lincoln administration was going to give them the shit into the rail splitter, right? They were not going to get it. But the thing is, it wasn't that Lane was lying. He just assumed under the 2nd conscription and the Militia Acts of 1862 that they'd be eligible and that they would be supported.
Well, really, I think they should have been.
Well, that's what he was thinking. So the thing is, the men of the 1st Kansas, this is actually surprising. They would not see one dime when they joined in August of 1862. You know when they got their first paycheck in the U.S. Army?
I'm going to guess it was after January 1st, 1863.
It was summer of 63.
Oh, I would have been.
It was
like,
almost
no,
it was
we're not
almost
doing
a
this.
full year. By then they were brought into federal service and they were the 79th U.S. Colored Volunteers. But these guys served basically for free for a year. They got no uniforms. So Lane, Williams, and Seaman from the recruiters, they had to improvise. And to make uniforms out of gray cloth they found at Leavenworth, which ironically meant when they went into battle, they wore the colors of the Confederacy. They did not wear the blue uniform. Most of the uniforms was sewn together by their wives or mothers of the men who were in camp with them. For weapons, they had old Austrian or Russian low-quality muskets. It was nothing. Probably the old iPhones, nothing.
Yeah, nothing. You can't do anything
with the plug
with
in the top. It's useless.
Oh, yeah, I remember that.
But 9 of the 10 companies, here's the thing, 9 of the 10 companies in the 1st Kansas were commanded by white men, except for one, Company D, which was led by a black man named William D. Matthews. Mm-hmm. Matthews was a freedman who was a conductor on the Underground Railroad. And he was given authority to raise his own regiment, or his own company, rather. He did so, and his subordinate officer, who was named Patrick Minor, was also black. So it was a company completely made of African-American men, including its commanders. I mention him because he was absolutely adored by his men. He absolutely was.
Matthews?
Even his white commanders, James Williams and Henry Seaman, noted that he was an outstanding officer. Regardless, when the regiment got brought into federal army service in January of 63, the Lincoln administration dumped them both. And they replaced him with a white officer named Andrew Armstrong.
Of course they did.
This led William Matthews and Patrick Minor to both quit the Army, which is a real shame because it led to a lot of bad feelings throughout the regiment that never, ever went away.
And did you know that Matthews was a Freemason?
He was a big high rank. He was a Prince Hall high-ranking Freemason. He was.
Yeah, and I would encourage our listeners, if you Google William D. Matthews, Civil War, you will recognize the picture that comes up. It's a very famous picture of an African-American soldier that is Matthews. So real quick about him. He was born on October 25th, 1829 on the eastern shore of Maryland. He had mixed race parents, so his father Joseph was from Delaware and of African descent, and his mother was the half-white slave daughter of a Frenchman, and she had gained her freedom upon her father's death. Matthews lived in Baltimore in the late 1840s, and he worked as a sailor until 1854 when he purchased his own vessel and worked on the Chesapeake Bay and Potomac River. He sold the boat and eventually left Maryland, and he moves to Leavenworth, Kansas in 1856. And the rest is history.
If he didn't get bumped and quit the Army, he would have been a first A-list Civil War person in today's history. There's no question he would have been. He absolutely would have been. But didn't turn out too well for him. But the first Kansas Coloreds, they're going to drill at Fort Scott, which the men affectionately called Hell's Headquarters.
Sounds wonderful.
Due to its mosquitoes, snakes, and the lack of vanilla for their pancakes, right? The black troops also had to deal with white troops who were not very accommodating to drilling and training with black men, as you can imagine. They knew they had to prove themselves to the whites, so they had to do so by drilling to almost perfection, just perfect. Mm-hmm. Colonel Norman P. Chipman, he was a white colonel from Milford, Ohio. He was the man who was in charge of doing the final inspection for the 1st Kansas to see if they were ready to go into battle. So on October 15th, he did this, and this is the report he wrote the next day about the 1st Kansas. Quote, laying aside the question as to the policy and propriety of making soldiers of the Negro race and viewing them as machines of war, I must say that the inspection was highly satisfactory. They exhibit a proficiency in the manual and in company evolutions truly surprising, and the best company is the one officered by a black man. This is William Matthews. The white officers are enthusiastic and think they would rather drill and discipline black men than white men. I know that I've seen many regiments longer in service than these, which would appear badly beside them, and if they would have the opportunity to strike a blow for the freedom of their brothers. This is October 16th, 1862. So it's clear that the 1st Kansas were not going to be merely used as laborers like originally they thought. They're going to be fighters, and it's not going to take long until they first see that elephant. Across the border in Bates County, Missouri, there was a group of pro-slavery guerrillas causing issues near the town of Butler, Missouri, and it was called the Bates County Partisan Guerrillas, led by Captain Bill Turman. It was decided that would be the job of the 1st Kansas to cross into Missouri and put them down. Now, this is going to be the first trip for a lot of these men going back into Missouri since they escaped slavery. None of the troops had ever fired a gun in combat before, but they were willing to fight even with these crappy weapons. So on October 26th, they're going to leave from Fort Lincoln in Kansas, and they're going to march 20 miles into Missouri. Now, previous intelligence reported that Turman's Bates County partisan guerrillas were camping on a swampy island called Hog Island on the Osage River.
Did they have beer?
I hope so. What was I going to do?
Hog Island.
But the 200-plus men of the 1st Kansas arrived on October 27th of 1862 at the farm of Enoch Toothman and his wife Christina. The Toothmans, not Teethman, Mary, Toothmans, were Southern sympathizers, and their son John was a prisoner of war back in Fort Lincoln.
I'm resisting making a West Virginia joke right now.
Don't. But when here's the thing: when these black troops arrived, Enoch, the father, was not home. It was just Christina and their 2 daughters, Emma and Amanda, who they called Lucy. By the by, right? I can only imagine what was going through their heads when 200 black Union troops marched to their house that day. What they must have been going through their heads.
Wow.
Colonel Williams and Captain Henry Seaman, they were both white commanders, told Christina that they're going to be taking over their property and will be using it as their headquarters in Bates County. Once they set it up, they named it Fort Africa. The first thing Williams and Seaman did was question Christina and said about these partisan numbers. How many men do they have? And of course, she's going to say that Captain Turman had well over 700 troopers on Hog Island, which was obviously a lie, designed to scare them off and try to make them leave. Mm-hmm. But they knew that they were probably outnumbered more than 2-1. This first Kansas, they're going to raise the U.S. colors over Fort Africa, and they're going to show any troops and any Rebs in the area that they're there and they ain't leaving. That first night at the Toothman farm was quiet, and I imagine the reality of the situation had to be sinking to the minds of the men. They had no idea what waited for them. All they knew is that they were going to be in a fight, and it was unlikely that any of the black men were going to be allowed to surrender. They knew this was going to be life or death. Yeah. On Wednesday, October 29th, this is their second morning there now, Williams and Seaman are going to send out a scouting party, and they're going to find guerrillas and basically go and find them. And soon they came upon a picket line of rebels on horseback on a hill that was basically on a big prairie, so it was just flat land. And there's going to be a rise, and these rebels are going to be on their horseback, just staring at them, watching their farm.
Just going to stare.
Just going to stare. Henry Seaman had 70 of his men, and Captain Richard Ward, who was captain of that group, he commanded 170. They're all armed again with those subpar Austrian muskets. They're going to return to report what they saw, and when they do, they basically find out that our rations are starting to run out. We're running low on food. So they had to kind of come up with a foraging party to find food for the first Kansas. Yep. So to basically try to hide the party, because they knew the Rebs were out there watching them, to try and hide this foraging party, a smaller group of troops is going to be sent out as a skirmish line to try to mask the foraging party and keep the Rebs away from them as they hunt the food. I mean, logically, right? The skirmish line troops quickly found themselves being fired upon by these guerrillas. And the first Kansas fired back, and they're going to chase the guerrillas back to their camp. It's just a skirmish line across that open prairie. But soon it was noticed that the guerrillas began to set the prairie on fire, which spread and covered the whole area with smoke, which allowed them to hide their numbers. The foragers are going to be successful, and they're going to return to Fort Africa with food for the regiment. But by then, the smoke from the prairie fires were so thick that the men could barely see their own hands in front of their faces. And this is going to make these Kansas men very scared, Mary. Right? Mm-hmm. Seaman and Captain Ward, they're also getting nervous because you can't see what's out there. It's like being in a deep fog.
Yep. They
decide they're going to send a Cherokee scout out to see what's up, who has one of the best names in the Civil War. His name is John Six Killer. That's his name.
Wow.
And he's John Six Killer is a Cherokee scout. The men in his group are his former slaves. They all escaped. They all rejoined in Cherokee to fight for the Union.
Wow.
They're going to go out into the smoke, and they're going to report back what they saw. They tried to get as close to the Rebs as they possibly could without being seen, but they still wanted to see Fort Africa through the smoke, so they can get back. It was that thick. They didn't know where the hell they were going to be going. Back at Fort Africa, Captain Seaman suddenly hears gunfire coming from that smoky prairie in front, so he'll respond by ordering Company F, commanded by Lieutenant Joseph Gardner, to ride out and bring the scouts back. You hear gunfire, go get the guys back. What the hell's going on here? They rode out about a mile, where they found John Six Killer and his scouts were there, and all of a sudden, from the tree line came 300 horsemen charging full speed at them. The Kansas men turned, tried to rush back to the camp with 300 guerrillas on horseback closing the gap on them. They must have been kind of far away because they ran for a little bit. They're going to kind of go over a rise, and they're going to kind of go down into a little hollow, a little valley. Lieutenant Gardner is going to realize that we can't outrun these horses. So he orders the men, when they climb over that rise and descend into that hollow, he orders his men to halt, set up a defensive line, form ranks, and get into battle line. The men of the 1st Kansas are going to get in their first battle line, and they're going to wait through the smoke for the horsemen to arrive, climb that hill in their front, and then as soon as they come across that hill, they were going to hit them right in the face. And that's exactly what happens. The guerrillas are going to arrive on the top of the hill. The 1st Kansas is going to fire, and this is going to be known as the Battle of Island Mound. And this is the beginning, and this is going to be the first battle in the Civil War to involve a black regiment.
Yeah. So this is before the 54th gets involved.
This is way before.
Almost, it's a year.
This is before Robert Gould Shaw even goes to Antietam.
Yeah. So it's way before that. So
No, it was October. It was after.
Yeah. So this is the first time African Americans in the Civil War are going to be in combat is 1862. Yeah.
Lieutenant Gardner, he's a white commander of Company F. He'll be shot twice, once in the thigh and once in the knee. And he's basically on the ground trying to crawl away. A rebel approached him, shot him point blank in the head. But somehow the bullet bounced off his head and he survived. It just ricocheted off of his head. Lucky guy, right? The captain of Company A, though, Captain Andrews G. Crew, wasn't as lucky. He was chased down by the guerrillas, and they killed him. They were targeting the white officers, is what they were doing. But the troops, with their commanders falling, they kept fighting. Even with their commanders down, they kept going. They were sitting ducks in the middle of this prairie, but they didn't run, and they kept fighting despite the smoke, the screaming, the horses. They kept going.
The Rosewoods Clowns.
Rosewoods Clown. The battle devolved into hand-to-hand combat with several men trying to strangle each other. That's how bad this one got. One of the 1st Kansas men, an escaped slave, amazingly named George Washington, said that he was covered in blood, but couldn't tell if the blood was his or somebody else's. Eventually, the guerrillas had enough, and they fell back over the hill and went back to their camp, which is going to end the Battle of Island Mound. And the Kansas men held the ground, so they won the battle. The 1st Kansas Colored Volunteers had 8 killed, including Captain Crew, and, sad to say, John Six Killer didn't make it.
Yeah, one Cherokee. And the New York Times, there was a correspondent from the New York Times who had been with them, and he said that, the action of the African Americans had been heroic, and he said it was desperate bravery. And it was described that they fought like tigers.
It was actually the guerrillas who said that quote.
Yeah.
That was actually the ruffians who said that. They said they fought like tigers.
Ruffians, I love that term.
The dead were buried back at the Toothman farm, except Captain Crew. His body was sent back to his family in Kansas. And no one knows what the guerrillas were as far as their casualties. They never got reported. But what this did, though, is it put any lingering doubts that these black soldiers would not fight to rest. I have to imagine that this battle was in Lincoln's mind when he wrote the Emancipation Proclamation.
I think so, too. And honestly, I think this battle and some of the other ones, in looking at the 1st Kansas and the other ones that they were in, like, they are worthy of episodes of their own because they never get talked about, but they are so important in studying the Civil War because this is the first these are the first African Americans that are fighting, and not to downplay the 54th. The 54th are, they deserve all the accolades they get for what they did, but I feel like the 1st Kansas, after researching them, gets left behind, and they're deserving of their story being told as well.
Let's say first South Carolina, first Louisiana, home.
Yeah,
There's a lot
all the other ones.
But I mentioned that former slave turned Kansas soldier George Washington, and I want to tell a quick story about him. Because I went down a rabbit hole with him because I was kind of fascinated by his story. He was born in Rappahannock County, Virginia. He was given away as a wedding present by his master and was forced to move to Missouri.
What?
Anyway, his new master was hearing rumors of slaves running into Kansas. So you know what he did at night? He chained Washington to the wall in his root cellar. That's how he slept, chained to a wall. One day, Washington decided that he had to try to escape. So he got together with a few slaves, and they made their escape that previous January. It was cold. When they got to the Missouri River, that's the landmark that separates Missouri from Kansas, it was frozen solid. So he literally walked right across the frozen river into Kansas. He was one of the first escaped slaves to sign up for service, eventually joining Company F with the 1st Kansas. And he joined because he felt, being a soldier meant freedom. He raised enough money to purchase his own rifle and made his own uniform. He'll survive the entire war, and he'll live to be 91 years old. He's buried in Clinton Cemetery in Douglas, Kansas. But he's one of those.
This is George Washington.
George Washington. He's one of those guys. And there's so many stories of men like that in this regiment. After the Battle of Island Mound, the men of the 1st Kansas Colored, they basically got some time off. They got a kind of reward. Yeah. November 9th, 1862, the Leavenworth Times published a quote from one of the men of the 1st Kansas, who I imagine was an officer, and it said, quote, "Our 9 days campaign proved that Negroes are splendid soldiers, will march further as well and live on hard fare without grumbling as any soldier now in the service of the government." By the time they returned to service, the Emancipation Proclamation had been issued, and on January 13th, 1863, the 1st Kansas was mustered into the federal service, becoming the 79th U.S. Colored Infantry. Now, it's interesting. The 79th USCT was the 5th Colored Regiment to be officially mustered in, 4 regiments behind the 54th Mass, which is likely where the confusion about Robert Gould Shaw's troops being mistakenly considered the 1st comes from.
Yeah.
I mean, I'm sure it does.
Yep. Now, is that that picture you were telling me about that everybody says is the 54th? That is not the 54th.
No.
Who is that?
It's probably the 79th. I'm not 100. It's definitely not the 54th. But I know the one you talk about. There's a couple of different ones. I'm not really 100% sure which one you're talking about, but
they're all lined up and they're looking right at the camera.
That's like all of them. But it's okay. But the 79th is out there. There's a whole bunch of different ones that are out there. But we're not going to go on back with that. But when they do come back, like we said before, William Matthews and Patrick Minor are no longer officers in Company D, and the entire regiment was commanded by white officers. Now, the regiment is going to go on to fight in a ton of battles, mostly in Oklahoma and Arkansas. The battles of Cabin Creek, Honey Springs, Second Cabin Creek, Timber Hills, and Jenkins Ferry. Now, all of these are deserving of more detail. They really are. We can do one later on. But there's one battle that's important to briefly highlight that's not in that list. It is the battle that took place on April 18th, 1864, that took place at a place called Poison Spring, Arkansas. Now, this is part of that bigger Red River campaign, that joint Army-Navy campaign led by the great Waltham native Nathaniel Banks and Rear Admiral David Dixon Porter. Banks and Porter had arranged to meet in Shreveport, Louisiana, where the combined force would try to invade Texas. That was the deal. Part of this force was going to require that General Frederick Steele would lead his 10,000-man army from Little Rock to meet them in Shreveport to join the campaign. This small expedition was going to be called the Camden Expedition. Steele wanted no part of this, and he made his opinion very, very clear. He said the roads in Arkansas are horrible. There's little food in the area. The whole region is infested with clowns, partisans, everything.
There's no DQs.
He just felt that it was dangerous. Well, U.S. Grant chimed in, and guess what? General Steele was highly advised to participate, and he did.
Highly advised. You were highly advised to participate in this battle.
March 17th, St. Patty's Day, 1864, Steele is going to begin this Camden expedition. Now, by April 17th, a month later, Steele's army was predictably running low on food, just like he said. He ordered Colonel James N. Williams to lead a train of 198 empty wagons, along with 1,000 soldiers, back to the town of Washington, Arkansas. They went through to liberate a bunch of corn that they had heard was there. Within this 1,000 soldiers was 438 men of the 1st Kansas Colored, a.k.a. the 79th U.S. Colored, along with their white officers. This regiment had a really good reputation with the Army. Major James Blunt probably said it was beautiful. Yep. But after the battle...
We talked about him recently.
We did. But Blunt, after the Battle of Honey Springs on July 17, 1863, previously in modern-day Oklahoma, he wrote, quote, "The 1st Kansas Colored particularly distinguished themselves. They fought like veterans and preserved their unbroken line throughout the engagement." So go back forward now. While they're foraging that corn west of Camden on April 17th, 4,000 Rebs commanded in their cavalry by John S. Marmaduke are going to see them. And they're going to take control of an intersection of the road of the Camden-Washington Road near the town of Poison Spring, Arkansas. And by doing so, it cut off Colonel Washington from returning back to Camden. They were separated. They were cut off. Williams is going to run into these Rebs. He will immediately order a defense around these wagon trains. They just filled up with corn. That was the whole point of the mission. The 438 men of the 1st Kansas Colored were put in charge of protecting the wagon train. Marmaduke's men are going to attack twice, and they're going to fail twice. Third time is going to be the charm, and it's going to finally break the the Union line, forcing Colonel Williams to issue Special Order GTFO. And what's going to happen is Marmaduke is going to basically push the fleeing Union men through a swamp, but eventually he's going to give up because he wants the trains. He's going to turn their focus to the wounded and the captured men of the 1st Kansas who are lying wounded. And I mentioned that story about General Blunt, about the 1st Kansas at Honey Springs for a reason, because their actions there are going to come back and haunt them here. Among Marmaduke's army of Rebs were members of the Choctaw tribe, who the 1st Kansas fought and beat easily at Honey Springs.
Weren't these the Choctaws were the ones that Albert Pike had?
He had part of his Indian brigade.
Pea Ridge.
I'm not sure if they were all, but they were certainly part of it. They was spread out.
Yeah.
But these Choctaws had a score to settle with these 1st Kansans, who were made up of blacks and Cherokees. And these Choctaws showed no mercy on them. The wounded and captured men of the 1st Kansas, they were bayoneted and scalped by the rebel Choctaws in what will become known as the Poison Spring Massacre.
This sounds like it's almost worse than like Fort Pillow.
Yeah, probably. I mean, it's similar. I mean, absolutely.
Yeah.
Of the 438 men of the 1st Kansas Colored engaged, 117 were killed and 65 missing, presumably murdered by Marmaduke's men.
Wow.
One of the survivors of the massacre said that the men of the 1st Kansas made a vow that day that they'll never be taken prisoner. They'll never be taken alive in battle for what happened at Poison Spring. Remember, Poison Spring was their battle cry from the rest of the war. Also in late 1864, the issue of black soldiers getting $10 while the white peers got 13 was finally addressed. The man leading the charge to get the blacks equal pay was guess who? James Lane.
Yep.
The man who first put on the uniform back in 1862. So thanks to his efforts, the War Department changed the rules on pay, and they actually agreed that all should be paid $13 regardless of color.
Wasn't that a thing in the movie Glory?
It was. And that was a big deal. It was, and that was absolutely true. But you know what Lane tried to do? He tried to get retro pay for these guys.
Oh, good for him.
He wanted to get the guys paid back to August of 62, and the War Department wasn't having that.
Wow, and that's
not.
an absolute government thing right there. Like if you don't, like if you suddenly
Yeah.
you make more money, we're gonna retro pay you.
Yeah, he tried. Give him credit. October 1st, 1865, the 1st Kansas, or 79th U.S. Colored Infantry, was going to be mustered out of military service for good at Pine Bluff, Arkansas, which is going to end their career in the American Civil War. But after the war, many of the men stayed in Kansas and didn't return to the states they came from and didn't escape from. They got recruited in the states they went to. As they moved through different states, Arkansas, different places, they would recruit there. So a lot of the men were from those states, those slaves, and they tended to basically leave those states after. Very few people stayed and settled where they were from after this war. One of the really surprising facts of the story is during the American Civil War, only 16 USCT soldiers were awarded the Medal of Honor. Most of them came from the Battle of New Market Springs. The number of Medal of Honor winners from the 1st Kansas, guess how many?
Zero.
Wow.
Wow.
James, it's you know, but there's a lot of people.
Insane.
But, I mean, it is what it is. But especially Honey Springs and Poison Springs, there's a lot.
Yeah, Honey Springs, Poison Spring, and I know you and I talked about this kind of like last night a little bit when we were talking about this episode, but like in the movie Lincoln, at the beginning, the two African American soldiers that are talking to Lincoln, the one guy says, "Oh, we were at Jenkins Ferry," and I had seen that in my research for this, but you told me it likely wasn't.
Well, that quote those guys said about not being taken prisoner was directly from after Poison Spring.
So you said that was
it's the same. It's the same.
They were mixing the two battles.
Well, he said that. Well, who knows? But that quote he said was the same quote that the 1st Kansas 79th USCT said after Poison Springs. So maybe they just continued all the way through. But that quote that he says was the exact quote the men said after Poison Springs.
Well, now I want to watch the movie Lincoln again.
All right, fine. So James Henry Lane, just to tie this all together, his post-war story is also equally bizarre too.
Sad.
Because towards the end of the war, Lane was an aide-de-camp for General Samuel R. Curtis with the Army of the Border. And he fought at the Battle of Westport on October 24th, 1864, to help secure Missouri for the rest of the war. When the war ends, though, Lane is going to surprisingly join President Andrew Johnson, and fight against Reconstruction, which is being pushed by the radical Republicans. So he was all over the place with this stuff.
Yeah, I was like, when you and I were talking about that last night, I was like, what? Like, how is this the guy that he, recruits the 1st Kansas, but then he's part of, going with Andrew Johnson, and he's against Reconstruction?
Well, I mean, it's a lot of different aspects of Reconstruction besides just the slavery thing, but it's a big part. You think that he would, but what he's going to do by doing this, I mean, he's burning both ends of the candle. He's pissing everybody off, right? He's going to create a lot of political enemies by doing this. He's going to be accused of defrauding Indians out of money by getting them to sign fake contracts, and it's going to lead to all kinds of pressure. And he had mental issues, he had depression. He'll put a gun to his head at Fort Leavenworth on July 1st of 1866, and he's going to shoot himself. He will linger for 10 days before dying on July 11th, putting the end of his story. But just, you mentioned the 54th Mass. It's hard not to talk about the 1st Kansas without talking about the 54th Mass. And again, it's like talking about this battle, and you don't want to tick off this battle. At the end, the story of the 1st Kansas Colored Infantry, it doesn't get the, watch it now, glory that the 54th Mass does.
Jeez.
But it can certainly be argued that their efforts were just as or more important than Shaw's men. Though the movie Glory, it doesn't directly mention the 1st Kansas like that, it does tell the overall story of African Americans who fought in the war and the experiences they had.
Well, I think there are aspects of the 1st Kansas that get brought into the movie Glory.
There's no question.
And that's clear from that. And it's like, we're not putting down the 54th here. It's like the 1st Kansas deserves recognition as well, especially since they are the first African American regiment to be in combat.
I mean, whether it's the 1st Kansas, the 1st South Carolina Home Guard, the Louisiana Native Guard, etc., the stories and bravery of these African American soldiers, whether free men or escaped slaves, is a story that really can never be forgotten by those who study this country's history, because it is such an important part. Tens and thousands of African Americans fought. And it's not just it's the 55th Mass. I mean, it goes on and on and on. And there's so many great stories. And although we've had fun a little bit talking about the 54th Mass, what that movie did do is create an awareness to it.
Yeah.
Now, it's not the most historically accurate movie. None of these movies are, but it does tell the story, and it does take some liberties, but it does show the plight of these men. It's easy. It's a more sexy story with Robert Gould Shaw and fighting at Fort. But you could have made this movie about this Kansas one very, very easily. The Battle of Island Mountain's probably not going to be as attractive as Charleston, but at the end of the day, what they did is this 1st Kansas, what they did is they basically set the mold going forward. So when Lincoln does issue his preliminary Emancipation Proclamation after Antietam, and when it finally goes in January 1963, he knows what? He knows that they'll fight.
Yeah.
And if the men fight as hard as the 1st Kansas, it's going to make him look good. And they did.
They absolutely did. And the one guy that gets forgotten, and I mean, there's others that are forgotten too, but, William D. Matthews is a guy that does not get recognized enough. And he gets demoted after the Emancipation comes into play, which, I mean, it's very, very unfair. But
it robbed him of a name in history, because I mean, most people never heard of William Matthews, and why would they? Because most people don't study these type of things at this depth, and that's normal. But if he was allowed to continue and develop, and he potentially could have been the first black officer. And you look at the Colin Powells of the world now in the past, they can all owe a little bit of their successes to Matthews directly. But he's pushed away from history because the Lincoln administration, Halleck, Stanton, all of them, they wanted no part of it. They wanted to make sure that it was going to be all white officers, which is really a shame. And it's one of those stories that because it didn't end well. No. He quits. Him and Minor quit the army. He does get they do give him some sort of an officer title afterwards, but by then he's already quit and he's done with it.
But it's like really now you're doing this?
Yeah, I mean
You know?
they missed the opportunity, and it wasn't like he didn't do a good job. His men loved him. The white officers loved him.
Yeah.
Everyone said that his company D was the best regiment. I mean, the best company in that regiment. And it just wasn't. It wasn't time. It's unfortunate that he was born probably 50 years too
Yep.
early. If you really think about
Yeah,
it.
which is really sad. And I think, he's another guy that you could do a whole episode on him and talk about his life.
No, he certainly could.
Yeah.
But I think the first Kansas, it's an important story, and it's one that I think for whatever reason, why? It's because the 54th Mass overshadows, and that's
Yep.
totally
and again,
fine.
that's because that is partially because of the movie Glory.
Well, it's all because of the movie Glory.
Yeah, and nothing. The movie Glory is amazing. It's one of my favorite movies, and
Robert, you got Matthew Broderick, you got Denzel. You got
Morgan
Freeman. I mean, it's a great movie. It's a fantastic movie.
I remember going to see it in the theater. Like, it is a great movie, but it is, it does pull in elements of the story of the first Kansas, but the first Kansas and other regiments are the ones to see combat before them.
Mm-hmm. And the other big difference too, as we've wrapped this whole thing up, this first Kansas, they were almost every one of them were escaped slaves.
Yep.
And so they were going into slave territory to fight against their masters' states,
Yep.
their masters sometimes. The 54th Mass don't forget, politically, they wanted, Governor Andrew back in Massachusetts, they wanted these really smart, educated
Yep.
freedmen to represent. So there was that perception that they wouldn't fight unless they were educated, which proved to be wrong. And all they had to do was look at what happened with Kansas, and
Yep.
and they could have done a lot of different things with that. But it all worked out for them in the end. Unfortunately, they did not get the credit they do. But now we're talking about them, so they're still floating
Yep.
around out there. They're still being remembered.
And I think, us looking at the first Kansas has given us other episode ideas where we can kind of dive deeper into Poison Spring, into Jenkins Ferry, into some of these
Honey
other
Springs, yeah, we'll do-
Honey Springs, into these other battles they have done that, in my opinion, and I'm sure you would likely agree with me, that they don't get studied enough, and they need to, because there's a lot being done about the mainstream battles of the Civil War, but I feel like there's not enough being done about these lesser known ones.
Well, you got, and you remember too, this is a group of people who were recruited in this regiment, right? They're told it's a pathway to citizenship, but you're going to get paid, you're going to get clothes, you're going to get uniforms, you're going to get a gun, all the stuff, right?
Yeah.
And they got nothing. They got no pay, and for the men who fought with them, they went almost a year without getting paid and still did it, and they didn't gripe, they didn't complain, and it's just so they were fighting for the right reasons ultimately.
Well, I think coming into it, and I can't say, I don't know, I can't say, but maybe it was something about that you have escaped your freedom, and finally you are fighting for something that is fighting for your freedom.
Well, you bring yourself self-value.
Yes.
And you want to be considered ultimately a citizen. You want to have, and that's what you want to do. So they're a great story, and they're certainly a regiment that deserves a story to be told. It's it's Black History Month, so it's an important time to tell these stories.
Yeah.
But again, at the end of the day, there's not a lot about them you can read about it, but certainly go out there and research people like this and some of these folks, and you'll find that they're quite fascinating stories.
And in the future, we will be doing more episodes that involve these guys. Coming up for us, we have our next episode. We are going to be joined by our friend Dave Taylor to talk about his Abraham Lincoln or John Wilkes Booth escape tours that he's going to be doing in March and April of this year.
And not just his tour, but we're going to talk about what the actual history was.
Yep, exactly.
But our friend Dave is running tours, and you can we'll talk about that in more detail later, but you can sign up. I think it's $145 a person,
Yes.
I think.
Yep.
And it includes a bus trip throughout the entire area, going into a lot of the buildings, not just the Surratt House, not just the Mud House, but probably a lot of Huckleberry. I don't know if he goes to Elizabeth Quisenberry's house or not, but
Places that you can't get. It's basically access to private property, and so you can check that out. We do in April. We will be doing a 2-part two parts on the Battle of Shiloh. We will be revisiting that again. We talked about Shiloh in 6 years ago now, I guess it was.
Oh, it's amazing how fast the time goes.
6 years ago. We're going to be revisiting that in a little bit more detail, maybe a little bit different facts since we've had some more time to study the Civil War. And we'll be doing our roundtable again soon.
We do. We got a lot of fun stuff coming up.
planned.
So, all right. So what's we already do what's coming up for us. I always said that. It's like Pavlovia. What's coming up for us, Mary? All right. So I was listening, I swear. Any final words from you?
Well, thank you for bringing it like you always do. Thank you to our listeners for listening to us, for supporting us for these last 163 episodes. We could not do this without you. After researching this episode, I definitely want to do more about the first Kansas and the battles they fought in, but also more about the African American troops that were fighting in the Civil War, and also too about the Native Americans, the Anishinaabes, the Choctaws, the Cherokees that were fighting in the Civil War too.
Absolutely. So a lot of fun stuff coming down the pike. Off we go. All right, Mary, so we're going to get ready to roll. So everybody has a great weekend. It's Valentine's Day coming up, Mary, so I expect chocolates and candy, maybe a pick-me-up bouquet. But probably not. I'm probably going to get out of my grief. But it's okay. But everybody have a healthy and safe Valentine's Day. It's a long weekend. President's Day is coming up too. We got a couple holidays.
Did you say have a healthy and safe?
Healthy and safe. Be careful out there. Remember Hill Street Blues? You probably don't, but it's okay.
It's healthy and safe.
Never mind. All right, off we go. Everyone have a great weekend. We will talk to you all on the other side.
See y'all later.
Peace out.
Yep, bye.